Today is day 28 of the Karen Read trial. I'm going to give you part 2 of my daily recap. If you haven't watched part 1, be sure to go back to that. We are getting into the Commonwealth's next witness. Her name is Renee Stonebridge, and she is a coroner at the medical examiner's office. She is highly qualified. She has, I think, 4 different degrees. She also has all kinds of experience, is board certified too. She is the medical examiner that studied John O'Keefe's brain injuries, so we only hear from her for a little while. He had acute injuries, which meant that they happened within minutes or hours of his death, and she goes into a lot of his head wounds. We hear some about the head wounds from the next examiner, so I'll just give you a brief synopsis. But he was hemorrhaging around his eyes, in the back of his head where he had that laceration. She goes into the ruptured aneurysm in his brain as well. The main rupture was on the left area of the back of his head. He also has skull fractures, a major one followed by some smaller ones that can be consistent with a fall, and it can also be consistent with being hit with a vehicle and then falling. The next witness is the chief medical examiner. Her name is Irene Scordi-Bello, and I think she's been around for a while. I'm pretty sure I've seen her do autopsies in other cases. The judge gives a warning that they are going to see graphic images, and they're not pleasant. The cameras are not going to be able to see those images, so we're not going to get any of that, but she does provide diagrams in her testimony, which is really helpful. The judge warns that we are going to see some graphic images, and the jury is going to see all of that, but the camera and everybody at home, we won't be seeing that. Just to let you know, the explanation of these things is very graphic, so feel free to skip this video if you're not interested in hearing about this. Dr. Scordi-Bello is very experienced. She's board certified. Nobody's questioning her expertise at all. She said when she received the body, it was from the hospital, and he had evidence of medical intervention being done at the hospital. The cause of death was blunt impact injuries and hypothermia, and the manner of death could not be determined. She knows that a blunt object was used, as opposed to a sharp razor, because he had contusions, fractures, lacerations, which are tears in the skin, and abrasions. She observed the injuries on his head, and she started with his eyes. He had hemorrhaging around his eyes and bleeding. He had a laceration on his right eyelid. On the left side of his nose, he had abrasions, and on the back of the head, he had a laceration associated with a few scrapes. Here is the diagram that she provided, and she marked up everything. So this is going to go into evidence, and this is going to help the jury. So you can see everything that she marked here on the top part. We get into the abrasions and lacerations that are on his arm. He had cuts on his arm, the right arm. It's the posterior right arm and forearm. So she said that he was on the medical examiner's table with his palms up, and we learned that the abrasions were on the top and the under part of the arm. We learn about all of the injuries to John O'Keefe's head that we already heard from the last witness, and she has everything marked up on the graphic here. Also, the laceration here on the back of his head, it was on the right side. There's a brief recess, and then we get into his stomach injuries. He had small hemorrhages around his stomach, and I'm gonna butcher this, saying Wyszynski spots on his stomach that are related to hypothermia and or stress. He was hemorrhaging in his pancreas as well. We learn about his blood alcohol level. It was 0.21 grams per deciliter of alcohol. We learned that he flatlined in cardiac arrest at the hospital, and he does have fractures of his ribs and sternum, which is common for people that have gone through CPR. His body temperature was taken at 6:57 a.m. and it was 80.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal body temp obviously is 98.6. She said his clothing was wet, so that does speed up the levels of decreasing body temp. And talking more about some of the lacerations that he had, again, they were on the upper part and the under part of his arm. We learned that the lower part of John O'Keefe's body essentially has no injuries. He does have a small abrasion on his right knee, and there are some bruises on his hands. She says that they could be sign of the IV attempts going into his knuckles. She didn't see any bruising on his knuckles. His nails were intact and no fractures were in his hands. So her findings are that she's asked by Lally, is there any indication of a fight or altercation? And she says she did not see any major signs of a significant altercations. And then he asked her, what are some of the signs? And it's like the fingernails missing, defensive wounds, things like that. And then we end for the day. So today is Friday. I am going to start watching. It's a full day of testimony. They're in the lunch break right now. I'm going to try to catch up. And we are going to hear from the cross-examination from the defense.